They called me the difficult daughter. But how would you feel if your parents uninvited you for Christmas, then posted family means everything without you or Grandma in the photo? I didn't fight back. I just booked 2 tickets. 1 week later, while snow fell over Cleveland, Grandma and I stepped onto a beach in the Maldives, and when the sun hit the camera, I showed them the truth. They were no longer part of the family trust. Silence didn't break me. It became my weapon. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, don't forget to hit subscribe smash like button, and tell us in the comments where you're tuning in from. Rain had been tapping against the windows all afternoon, the kind of Seattle rain that blurs everything outside into soft gray streaks. I pulled off my headset after a late investor call and rubbed the bridge of my nose. The apartment was quiet except for the slow tick of the wall clock and the hum of the refrigerator. Then my phone buzzed. One new message. From Mom. This year, it's just Michael and his family. Don't make things complicated. For a few seconds, I just stared at the screen. The words didn't surprise me. They never did. Still, something sharp and familiar cut through my chest like a tiny blade. I set the phone down on the counter, the sound louder than I meant it to be. The coffee in front of me had gone cold. I took a sip anyway, bitter metallic. The taste reminded me of every year before this one, of the way they always managed to make me feel too much, too wrong. I whispered to no one. Same words. Different year. The apartment smelled faintly of rain and burnt toast. Outside, sirens faded into the distance. My hands itched with restlessness, the kind that comes when the air feels heavy with things you can't say. I pushed away from the counter and walked toward the big glass doors that opened to the balcony. The city looked washed out. Streetlights glowing like small ghosts' reflections stretching along the wet pavement below. I pressed my palm against the cold glass and felt the chill slide into my skin. And just like that, my mind slipped backward. I was 12 again in our old Cleveland house, standing behind a too-bright Christmas tree, while Mom handed Michael his gifts one by one. He was the golden boy, even then. Grinning as he unwrapped a new game console, the one I'd quietly asked for too, Mom clapped her hands, laughing. Our little man deserves the best. No one noticed me holding a small, crookedly wrapped box with my own name on it. To Lena, written in Mom's perfect cursive. It sat unopened for hours until I realized it wasn't forgotten by accident. It was the kind of forgetting that makes a point. Later that night, Grandma Helen found me behind the tree, pretending to fix an ornament. She bent down, smelling faintly of vanilla and soap, and pressed a small gingerbread cookie into my hand. I see you, sweetheart, she said softly. Even when they don't, I never forgot the warmth of that moment. It was the only part of that Christmas that didn't make me want to disappear. The memory dissolved as quickly as it came, and I was back in my Seattle apartment, 34 years old, the hum of the city all around me. I turned toward my desk. The laptop still sat open from earlier, a faint blue glow lighting the room. I touched the trackpad, and the screen came alive with numbers. My account balance, the final transfer from the ClearPath acquisition, $95,320,000. The sight of all those zeros didn't bring joy anymore. Not like it did the first week after the sale. It just felt like proof that I had built something real, something mine. Proof that I'd done it without them, I said quietly, almost to myself. They don't know, and they'll never understand. The clock on the wall clicked again. My reflection in the window looked like a stranger, tired, older, maybe a little colder. I slipped on my coat and stepped out onto the balcony. The air hit me instantly, damp and biting. From up here, I could see the lights of downtown flickering beneath the rain. My breath rose in small white clouds. Somewhere far below, someone laughed, the sound carrying up the wet air. I rested my arms on the railing and let the rain soak my sleeves. They still think I'm the difficult daughter. I murmured the words, barely leaving my lips. But this time, they're the ones who'll learn what difficult really means. I stayed there for a long while, watching the city blur and shimmer. Each drop of rain felt like punctuation to a promise I hadn't yet spoken out loud. Something had shifted inside me, quietly, without drama, but deep enough that I knew nothing about this Christmas would be the same. I turned off the balcony light and went back inside, leaving the glass doors cracked just enough for the sound of the rain to follow me. The room was dim, now filled with that soft electric hum that happens before a storm changes direction. On the counter, my phone lit up again, a follow-up text from Mom, just one word this time. Okay. I stared at it until the screen dimmed, and went black. Then I whispered to the dark, "Okay." But the word didn't sound like surrender anymore. It sounded like the start of something I hadn't planned yet, but already knew I would see through. Outside, the rain kept falling steady and relentless, like a rhythm I could finally match. The snow in Cleveland always seemed colder when I was a kid, sharper somehow, like it carried judgment in every flake. Our old red brick house sat on a quiet street lined with maples that bowed under winter's weight. Mom loved to decorate the porch with perfect white lights that matched the ones in every other respectable family's yard. Nothing too bright, nothing too loud, just enough to look proper from the street. Inside, everything smelled like pine and polish. Michael sat cross-legged by the Christmas tree, tearing through wrapping paper, his smile wide and camera-ready. Mom crouched beside him, adjusting the bow on one of his boxes. "You're just like your father," she said proudly. Dad, sitting in his recliner with a mug of coffee, laughed. "That's my boy." I stood in the doorway holding a folded piece of paper, the certificate from school for first place in the art competition. My fingers were cold from where I'd carried it all the way home from class that afternoon. "Mom," I said softly, "I got an award today. My teacher said my painting's going to the county show." She looked up just long enough to offer a tight smile. "That's nice, honey. But maybe next time don't make such a big deal. You know how easily your brother gets distracted." The sentence landed like a door closing. I nodded, even though my throat ached. I went to my room and sat on the edge of the bed, listening to the sound of their laughter drifting down the hall. I remember tracing the rim of that certificate with my finger until the paper started to bend. It didn't take long for silence to feel safer than speaking. Dinner that night was the same as every other night. Dad talked about his clients. Mom kept refilling Michael's plate. I asked if we could go see the art show when it opened next month. Dad didn't look up. "Daughter, remember to stay quiet when the adults are talking." The words came out sharp, his tone clipped and impatient. I learned to be quiet early. I thought, staring at the mashed potatoes I didn't want to eat. Years later, I could still hear the rhythm of that house, the way words floated one way and silence the other. By the time I hit 17, I'd become an expert at smallness. I smiled at the right times, kept my voice low. Never argued. Teachers called me mature. What they didn't know was that I was practicing invisibility. Then came the envelope. It arrived in early spring 2010, heavy cream paper with a Stanford crest embossed in red. I stared at it on the kitchen counter for nearly 10 minutes before I tore it open. When I saw the word congratulations, my knees went weak. A full scholarship to Stanford University, computer science. I had to read it 3 times to believe it. Dad walked in as I held the letter up. I got in, I said breathless. He scanned the first line, his brow furrowed. California. "That's too far. Why can't you go somewhere closer, something more practical?" "Kent State has a good business program." "It's a full scholarship," I said quickly. "I earned it. You won't have to pay anything." He shrugged already. Walking toward the fridge, still too far. Mom came in a few minutes later, wiping her hands on a dish towel. "That's nice, dear," she said, barely glancing at the letter. "Just remember, we don't talk about these things too much. People might think we're bragging." I wanted to shout to ask how success could be shameful, but the words stopped halfway up my throat the way they always did. I folded the letter neatly and slipped it back into the envelope. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, the glow from the hallway spilling across the carpet. I should have been ecstatic. Instead, I felt hollow. I had worked so hard hoping for one honest moment of pride in their eyes, but it never came. The day I left for Stanford, the sky was washed in gray. Mom stayed inside saying she had laundry to finish. Dad loaded my suitcase into the trunk without speaking much. Only Grandma. Helen Weston came to the airport. She wore her favorite wool coat, the one with missing buttons, and carried a thermos of tea for me. At the gate, she hugged me tightly and slipped a small envelope into my coat pocket. "Open it when you're in the air," she whispered, "and don't forget to breathe." When the plane took off, Cleveland shrank beneath a layer of clouds. I pulled out the envelope. Inside was a folded piece of stationery that smelled faintly of her perfume. In her shaky handwriting, she'd written, "Live bigger than this house." Tears welled before I could stop them. I pressed the paper against my chest and looked out the window at the sky, thinking about what bigger meant. Maybe it meant I didn't have to shrink anymore. Maybe it meant I could finally stop apologizing for wanting something different. The flight attendant asked if I wanted a drink. I shook my head, still holding the letter. The city lights below turned into glittering threads, the roads connecting and vanishing into the dark. I whispered to the window, "If I can't be loved, I'll at least be seen." That promise sat in me like a spark, quiet, determined, waiting for the right moment to catch. When the plane began its slow descent hours later, I opened my notebook and wrote the first entry of what would become my new life goal. Make them proud, even if they'll never say it out loud. I didn't know it yet, but that was the start of the story. I'd been writing all along. The story of how silence would eventually turn into something loud enough for the whole world to hear. Stanford smelled like eucalyptus and coffee. My dorm room was barely big enough for a desk and a narrow bed, but to me it felt like a kingdom. The walls were plastered with sticky notes covered in code equations and half-finished ideas. My laptop hummed constantly, its fan always running like it was breathing with me. Olivia sat cross-legged on the floor, her brown hair twisted up with a pencil. She was neat, methodical, the kind of person who made spreadsheets for fun. Ben, on the other hand, was sprawled across my bed, balancing a slice of pizza on one hand and typing with the other. He grinned at the screen. "If this works, he said we could save the world." I laughed, rubbing my temples. "Let's start with saving the supply chain." We'd been working on a project for our data systems seminar, an algorithm that could predict inventory shortages before they happened. What started as an assignment had quickly become an obsession. The more we worked, the more we realized what it could become. At 2 a.m., the campus was silent. Even the fountains outside the engineering quad seemed to hold their breath. I stretched my arms, cracked my neck, and looked at the lines of code flickering across my screen. My eyes burned, but I didn't stop. I couldn't. For the first time in my life, I felt completely in control of something. Most nights, I worked late after my library shift. Shelving books paid just enough for groceries and Wi-Fi. I'd slide heavy volumes into place, thinking about my family back in Ohio, about how my mom would be asleep by now, how my dad would be watching late-night reruns, how none of them had ever asked what I was studying or why it mattered. That night, as I pushed a cart through the quiet aisles, my phone buzzed. A text from Mom. "Michael just got a promotion. You still keeping that scholarship? Hope you're not spreading yourself too thin." I stared at the message for a full minute before tucking the phone away. My fingers were shaking, but not from exhaustion. It was the familiar sting of being reminded that I was never enough for them, not successful enough, not simple enough, not the kind of daughter who made sense. When I got back to the dorm, Olivia was asleep with her head on a stack of notes, and Ben had left a doodle of a stick figure labeled Future Millionaires. I smiled despite myself powered on my laptop again, and dove back into the code. The hours blurred. Outside fog crept over the campus lawns. My hands moved on autopilot, reworking a faulty loop that kept crashing the prediction model. Each keystroke felt like a heartbeat. Somewhere around 4 a.m., the error message vanished, replaced by a single word on the screen. Complete. I sat there frozen for a second, not believing it. Then I called out, "Liv." "Ben." It worked. Olivia jerked awake, eyes wide. "No way." "Show me." Ben stumbled over, rubbing his eyes. I hit enter. The graphs came alive, the data points stabilizing into perfect symmetry. For a moment, none of us breathed. Then the room erupted. Olivia screamed. Ben threw a notebook in the air, and I started laughing so hard tears rolled down my cheeks. We stood there, 3 sleep-deprived kids surrounded by cold pizza and coffee cups, staring at something that had only existed in our heads 2 days earlier. I didn't realize until later that it wasn't just the code that worked. It was me. For once, my instincts hadn't been too much. My intensity, the thing my mother called difficult, had built something real. By morning, the sunlight sliced through the blinds, washing over the mess we'd made. Olivia was already drafting a proposal to test the system on local businesses. Ben was muttering something about angel investors and the hashtag next big thing. I leaned back in my chair, closed my eyes, and let the hum of campus morning fill the room. Footsteps. Laughter, the distant bell tower. When I finally opened my eyes, I saw an email notification blinking in the corner of my screen. It was from a logistics professor who'd heard about our project. "Come see me. I think you're onto something big." I stared at those words for a long time. Maybe it was the lack of sleep, or maybe it was that small, stubborn spark inside me flaring back to life. Either way, I knew this was the beginning of something I couldn't walk away from. That night, while the others slept, I opened a new tab and drafted a message to the first potential investor I'd ever found through a student forum. My fingers trembled over the keyboard, but my heart felt steady. Hello, my name is Clara Hayes. I'm building a system to predict and prevent supply shortages before they happen. I'd love to show you what we've created. I read it 3 times before hitting send. The cursor blinked at the bottom of the screen like a pulse. Proof I was alive moving forward. Outside, the fog lifted. The moon hung pale over the palm trees, and the campus lights shimmered like a constellation built just for me. For the first time, I wasn't the difficult daughter. I was the girl who could make impossible things work. And in that tiny, crowded dorm room, I felt something I'd never felt before. Not approval, not validation. Just quiet, electric certainty that this was where my real life began. By the time I graduated in 2010, the name ClearPath had already begun to follow me around campus like a rumor. What started as a student project had grown teeth, late nights, endless debugging, and a belief that if we could predict the gaps in a supply chain before they happened, we could keep the world moving just a little smoother. In early 2015, I packed my life into a rented U-Haul and drove north from Palo Alto to Seattle. The city felt raw, gray skies, salt air, and the kind of quiet ambition that doesn't need to brag about itself. I rented a basement office on the south side of Capitol Hill. It smelled faintly of damp concrete and burnt coffee. The windows were small and high up, but when the light poured through in the morning, it made even the dust motes look hopeful. That basement became ClearPath's first headquarters. 3 desks, 1 couch that doubled as a nap spot, and a whiteboard so covered in equations that we had to start writing on the walls. Olivia managed operations, Ben handled data architecture, and I did everything else. Sales calls, investor pitches, even fixing the leaky pipes. At night, we wrapped ourselves in blankets and coded, while snow gathered outside the narrow windows. The hum of servers filled the air like a heartbeat. Some nights I slept under my desk with my laptop still open beside me. We were running on caffeine, adrenaline, and faith. Money was always tight. We lived off instant noodles and borrowed software licenses. When I called home, Mom asked, "Do you really need to stay in that city? You could come back, find a teaching job, something stable." I told her about the pilot clients we were signing, small retailers who wanted to use our predictive analytics. She sighed. "Just don't get your hopes too high, Clara. You've always been impulsive." That word again. I bit my tongue, said goodnight, and turned back to the glowing whiteboard. A year later, something shifted. The system started working the way we dreamed it would. Our early clients, 2 local distributors and a furniture chain, began sending feedback that shipments were arriving faster with fewer delays. They told friends. The friends told others. Within months, we were signing 3 more contracts. The thrill of those first deposits hitting our bank account was indescribable. For the first time, ClearPath wasn't just an idea. It was real. I celebrated by buying the team real chairs instead of using crates. Then came 2020. The first news reports of a virus trickled in, then exploded. Supply lines broke overnight. Hospitals ran short of masks, gloves, ventilators. It felt like watching a dam collapse in slow motion. Within weeks, my inbox flooded with messages from companies and hospitals desperate for help. Our system, once a quiet experiment, suddenly mattered. We stayed up for days rerouting shipments using data to anticipate which hospitals would run out of equipment first. I remember sitting in that same basement lit only by the glow of monitors, while outside ambulances wailed through the empty streets. It felt like standing in the center of a storm, and knowing somehow that we were holding something steady. One night, the local news ran a segment, "Seattle startup ClearPath helps hospitals prevent critical shortages." The anchor smiled into the camera, saying my name. My phone buzzed seconds later. A text from Mom. "Don't let people think you're showing off. It's not good for the family's image." I stared at it until the screen dimmed. My chest ached in that old familiar way, the one that told me, no matter how high I climbed, I'd never reach her approval. A few minutes later, another message arrived. From Grandma Helen. "I saw the news. I'm so proud of you, sweetheart. You always cared about helping people." I exhaled and whispered to the empty room. "Thank you, Grandma." When the pandemic eased, ClearPath had become something far bigger than I imagined. Journalists called us the nervous system of American logistics. We moved into a new office with windows that actually opened. I hired 20 people, but I still came in first and left last. Success didn't feel like a celebration. It felt like survival. Every new contract meant more responsibility, more risk. Yet each night when I turned off the lights and looked out across Seattle, I felt something I hadn't since childhood, a quiet sense of belonging. Then, one freezing February night, the call came. It was 3:15 a.m. I was half asleep on the couch in my office laptop, still open beside me. The screen lit up with an unknown number, Clara Hayes. The voice on the other end was crisp, confident. "This is Jonathan Greer, CEO of Axis Logistics. I've been following your company for months. We'd like to discuss an acquisition." For a moment, I couldn't speak. The only sound was the buzz of fluorescent lights overhead. "How much are we talking about?" I finally asked, my voice barely above a whisper. 100, maybe 120 million, depending on the structure, he said. "We'll send the paperwork tomorrow." My hand trembled as I hung up. I stared at the clock, 3:17 now, and laughed quietly to myself. The kind of laugh that comes from disbelief. I thought about calling someone, but there was no one to call who would understand. Instead, I stepped outside. Snow was falling again, flakes melting the instant they hit the ground. The city was still asleep. Somewhere between exhaustion and elation, I whispered, "Maybe now they'll finally see me." The words vanished into the air before I could take them back. I'd saved an entire system from collapsing, kept hospitals supplied during chaos, built something from nothing. Yet under all that, I was still that 12-year-old girl behind the Christmas tree waiting for someone to notice the gift she'd made. I closed my eyes and let the snow sting my face. I had just sold a company worth more than everything my family had ever owned. But deep inside, I was still chasing a simple thing. One honest word from my mother that might never come. Snow was already falling when my flight landed in Cleveland that November. The city looked exactly as it always had. Flat, gray, too quiet. By the time I pulled into my parents' driveway, the sky had gone soft with twilight, and the house glowed with the same yellow light that used to make me feel safe when I was a kid. Dad opened the door before I could ring the bell. "Well, look who's home," he said, his smile tight and practiced. The CEO herself. His tone was meant to be teasing, but it landed sharp. Mom appeared behind him, wiping her hands on a dish towel. "Come in." "Clara, don't let the cold in." Cold. She gave me a quick hug that barely grazed my shoulders. The scent of cinnamon and turkey filled the air, rich and familiar. Inside, the table was already set, perfectly folded napkins, polished silverware candles waiting to be lit. Michael's kids were playing on the living room floor, the TV murmuring softly in the background. My brother stood by the mantel phone in hand, showing off photos of a brand new house. "It's in Shaker Heights," he said proudly. 4 bedrooms, home office, backyard, big enough for a pool. Mom clasped her hands like it was the best news she'd ever heard. "You've earned it, sweetheart. You've always been so steady." I placed the gifts I'd brought on the counter, a silk scarf for Mom, a leather wallet for Dad, and a manila envelope for Grandma Helen. Her full medical checkup package at a private clinic in Columbus. When she opened it later, she teared up, whispering, "You shouldn't have spent so much, dear. I wanted to." I said softly. Dinner began in its usual rhythm. Dad carving the turkey like he was hosting a talk show. Mom fussing over side dishes, Michael giving an animated play-by-play of his latest business deal. I listened, nodded, smiled when appropriate. Then, somewhere between the mashed potatoes and the cranberry sauce, Dad turned to me. "You know, Clara, I've been meaning to ask you something." I looked up from my plate. "What's that?" He leaned back, folding his napkin neatly. "There's this small loan I'm taking for a new investment. Nothing major, just a formality. The bank needs a cosigner. Since you're doing so well now," my fork froze halfway to my mouth. "You want me to guarantee your loan?" He chuckled. "It's just paperwork. You wouldn't have to do anything. It would help speed things up." I set the fork down carefully. "Dad, I can't do that." The room seemed to pause. Even the kids stopped talking. He frowned. "Can't or won't?" "Won't," I said quietly. "I've worked hard to build something on my own. I'm not signing anything that ties me to someone else's debt." Mom's voice cut in sharp and sweet. "Oh, for heaven's sake, Clara, he's your father. It's not like he's asking for money. Why do you always make things so difficult?" That word again. Difficult. It clanged inside me like a bell. I took a breath, steadying my voice. "I'm not making anything difficult. I'm setting a boundary." Michael laughed under his breath. "Still dramatic, huh?" Mom shot him a warning glance, then smiled at me as if we were strangers at a polite dinner. "Let's not spoil the evening. Michael, tell us more about the new contract you landed." The conversation shifted away like water running downhill, smooth and intentional. I stared at my plate, the turkey gone cold, the cranberry sauce bleeding into the potatoes. I cut a piece and chewed slowly, tasting nothing. The candlelight flickered on their faces, Mom glowing with pride at Michael's story. Dad nodding approvingly, Grandma sitting quietly at the end of the table. In my head, a small voice said, "You're not in this story anymore. You're just watching it play out." Grandma's hand found mine under the table. Her skin was cool, her grip steady. When I looked over, she didn't say anything, just slipped a folded note into my palm. Later, when I excused myself to clear the dishes, I opened it behind the kitchen counter. In her neat, shaky handwriting, it said, "Don't let them make you small again." I pressed the note against my chest for a moment before slipping it into my pocket. The rest of the night passed in a blur of small talk and forced laughter. I watched my family perform their familiar roles like actors in a play that had run too long. Every line, every smile rehearsed to perfection. When the plates were cleared and the wine glasses half empty, I stood up. "I'm going to head upstairs for a bit," I said. Mom looked up, puzzled. "You don't want dessert?" "I made pumpkin pie." "I'm fine," I said. "Really." Upstairs, the air was cooler. My old room looked almost the same, posters fading on the walls, a box of trophies in the corner, the bedspread neatly tucked, as if waiting for someone who never returned. I sat on the edge of the bed and pulled out my phone. The group chat was still there, pinned to the top, family forever. The last message was from Mom months ago. "Michael's new house looks amazing." Without thinking, I opened the settings and deleted the chat. Then I blocked both my parents' numbers. The screen went blank quiet. Outside snow had started to blanket the lawn, glowing under the porch lights. From my window, I could see the reflection of the family still gathered downstairs, their laughter muffled, but constant. I rested my forehead against the cold glass. The yard shimmered with light, perfect serene. But inside, all I felt was the kind of cold that doesn't go away when you step back inside. Somewhere downstairs, Mom called out my name. I didn't answer. I pulled the blanket over my shoulders, let the sound fade, and whispered into the dark. "I'm done trying to fit into someone else's version of family." The house creaked under the weight of winter, and for the first time in years, I felt something close to peace, a hollow, trembling kind, but peace all the same. The city was already asleep by the time I closed my laptop that night. Seattle. In December, always felt like a secret, fog curling around the buildings, the streets empty except for the soft glow of stoplights reflecting off wet pavement. My office was silent except for the hum of the heater and the faint ticking of the wall clock. I rubbed my temples and leaned back in my chair, the kind of exhaustion settling in that comes more from emotion than work. I should have gone home hours ago, but work was easier than the silence waiting for me there. Then my phone buzzed on the desk, its screen lighting up with a familiar name, Grandma Helen. I hesitated for a second before answering. The video call opened to her living room in Cleveland, the same floral curtains, the old armchair she'd had for decades, and a tiny Christmas tree twinkling in the corner. The light in the room was dim, soft like a memory. "Hi, sweetheart," she said. Her voice warm, but a little tired. "You're still working this late?" "Yeah," I smiled faintly. "Deadlines never end, I guess. How are you?" "Did they set a date for Christmas dinner yet?" There was a pause. I watched her eyes shift away toward the tree. "That's actually what I was calling about," she said finally. "They're not hosting this year. Your parents said they wanted to keep it small. Just your brother and his family. You know, simpler that way." Her laugh was short, brittle, like glass about to crack. I stared at the screen, trying to keep my face neutral. "So, they didn't invite you either?" She shook her head lightly. "Oh, honey, don't look like that. I'm used to it. They probably just don't want to make a fuss. I'll stay home, maybe make myself some tea and read." Something inside me tightened, slow and painful. "Are you sad, Grandma?" I asked before I could stop myself. She smiled, small, gentle, and far too forgiving. "A little, maybe. But as long as you're happy, that's enough for me." Her words hit harder than anything my parents could have said. That's the thing about her. She never complained even when she should have. "I'm sorry," I whispered. "For what she asked. For them," I said. "For all of it." She waved her hand. "Oh, nonsense. Families are messy. Yours just more than most." Her eyes softened. "Don't you worry about me, sweetheart. I've got my books, my old movies. I'll be fine." But I could see the loneliness behind her smile. The way her shoulders sagged slightly, the way she fiddled with the corner of her blanket. We talked a little longer, about the weather, her doctor's appointment, my work. But even as we spoke, I could feel something shifting in me, quiet but certain. By the time we said goodbye, I already knew I couldn't let her spend Christmas alone. After I hung up, the office felt colder than before. I looked around the shelves lined with old company awards, my half-empty coffee cup, the soft blue glow of the city through the window. My gaze landed on the photo frame beside my desk, a picture of Grandma and me from years ago. She was laughing flour on her nose from baking cookies. I was 8, smiling like the world hadn't taught me restraint yet. Next to it on the corner shelf, my passport peeked out from a stack of folders. On the desk, my laptop screen still glowed faintly. The pieces aligned themselves before I even realized I was deciding. I opened the browser and typed flights to Maldives, December 22nd. Rows of results appeared, each one like a spark. I scrolled through, found a direct flight from Los Angeles first class. My heart began to race, not from excitement, but from something deeper, steadier. For years, I'd swallowed hurt like medicine, convincing myself it would make me immune. But watching my grandmother's face on that screen, hearing her pretend not to mind something cracked open, they had wanted a Christmas without me. Fine. But this time, I wouldn't just disappear quietly. I'd rewrite the story they kept telling, about me, about her, about who deserved to belong. I stared at the confirmation screen for the flight, the cursor blinking next to the words, "Confirm booking." My reflection shimmered faintly on the laptop screen. Tired eyes, messy hair, the ghost of a smile tugging at the corner of my mouth. "If silence is what they want," I whispered, "I'll make it loud enough, they'll never forget it." I clicked confirm. The screen flashed, then showed the ticket details. The rain outside had stopped. I stepped to the window, watching the city breathe under the streetlights, slick and silver. Somewhere out there, people were putting up Christmas trees, wrapping gifts, preparing to gather. I wasn't jealous anymore, just resolute. In the reflection, I caught sight of the photo of Grandma again, her bright, patient smile frozen in time. "You won't be alone this year," I murmured. I shut down the computer, slid my passport into my purse, and turned off the office lights. The elevator ride down felt endless, the hum echoing like a heartbeat. When I reached the lobby, I paused by the glass doors, watching the rain start again in thin, silvery sheets. My phone buzzed once on the way out, another message from the family group chat. I didn't open it. I didn't need to. By the time I stepped into the cold night air, I already knew what I had to do. They wanted a Christmas without me. I'd give them one they'd never forget. The air in downtown Seattle that morning carried the kind of sharp chill that wakes you up whether you want it to or not. The glass buildings along Elliott Bay caught the pale winter sun, turning the whole city into a mirror. I tightened the belt of my gray coat and stepped through the revolving doors of Carter and Rowe law offices. The receptionist smiled politely. "Ms. Hayes. Ms. Carter is expecting you." I nodded, walked across the marble floor, and pushed open the frosted glass door marked Rachel Carter, Estate Law. Rachel looked up from her desk as soon as I entered. She hadn't changed much since the days when we were both just starting out, still calm, still composed, the same dark hair pulled into a low bun. She stood to greet me with a quick smile. "Clara Hayes. It's been, 3 years I heard you sold ClearPath." "Yeah," I said, closing the door behind me. "That chapter's done. Now I need to fix something more personal." She gestured toward the chair across from her. "Sit. You sound serious." I slid a worn folder from my bag and placed it on her desk. "Family trust, established 2 years ago. I need to make amendments." Rachel put on her glasses and pulled the file toward her, scrolling through the digital version on her monitor. Her voice softened as she read aloud the familiar names. Ethan and Margaret Hayes, Michael Hayes, Helen Whitaker. She looked up. "Which ones are we changing?" I exhaled slowly. "The first 3. Her eyebrows lifted slightly. "That's a major change. You understand what that means legally, I do." She leaned back in her chair, studying me. "Clara, I've worked with a lot of clients who made emotional decisions. Once you sign, there's no going back. They could contest it, claim you were under stress or manipulated." I met her gaze. "They've been manipulating me my whole life. This isn't emotional. It's clarity." Rachel nodded as if measuring the weight of that word, and Helen. "She stays," I said softly. "She's the only one who ever showed up. I also want to add 2 charitable funds, one for women in tech and one for kids who grow up in families like mine." Her expression softened. "That's a beautiful idea." She started typing, the quiet click of the keyboard filling the room. Do you want me to keep the trust value the same? Yes. 95 million total distributed per the new terms. When she finished drafting, she turned the monitor toward me. Take a look. On the screen, the list of beneficiaries had changed. 3 names gone, 1 remaining, and 2 new lines in their place: Clear Path Women in Technology Scholarship and Safe Start Foundation for At-Risk Youth. Seeing it laid out that way felt surreal, like looking at the map of a life I'd just redrawn. Rachel printed the documents and slid them across the desk with a pen. If you're certain. I picked it up. For a second, the tip hovered over the signature line. I thought of my father's voice telling me I was ungrateful, of my mother's polite silence, of my brother's laughter the night I refused to sign his loan guarantee. Then I thought of Grandma Helen's small, shaky note, "Don't let them make you small again." The pen touched paper. The scratch of ink was crisp and final, like the closing of a door. Rachel stamped the notary seal, the press clicking against the paper. She smiled faintly. "Congratulations. You just rewrote your family's future." "Not theirs," I said, slipping the papers back into the folder. "Mine." We stood for a moment by the window, looking out at the city below. The ferries moved slowly across the water, leaving pale trails behind them. The world felt cleaner somehow, cold, but honest. Rachel broke the silence. "You know they'll find out eventually." "I'm counting on it." She tilted her head. "You don't want revenge, do you?" I smiled just a little. "No, I want peace. But sometimes peace looks a lot like justice." As I turned to leave, she called after me. "Clara, whatever happens, don't let them drag you back into the noise." "I won't," I said, and I meant it. Outside, the cold air hit me like clarity. I stepped onto the sidewalk, the wind biting my face, the folder pressed tight against my chest. For the first time in years, I felt light. Free, even. The kind of freedom that doesn't come from money or success, but from finally deciding who deserves your kindness and who doesn't. I walked toward the corner cafe to warm up, passing people bundled in coats and scarves, each lost in their own world. The smell of coffee drifted through the street. I stopped for a moment, letting the winter sun flash against the papers in my hand. They used to control every part of me, my silence, my guilt even, my definition of family. Not anymore. The pen in my hand had done more than change a document. It had shifted the ground beneath everything I'd been told to believe. As I turned down toward the bay, the breeze carried a faint hint of salt and snow. I pulled my coat tighter and smiled to myself. "I'm not theirs anymore," I whispered. "I never really was." And as the wind rushed past, I could almost hear the echo of Grandma Helen's voice in my head, warm and certain. "Live bigger than that house." I smiled wider. "I'm trying, Grandma. I really am." By the time I reached the crosswalk, the light had turned green, and the city around me came alive again. Buses hissing, people talking, gulls calling above the water. I tucked the folder under my arm and walked into the sunlight, feeling the cold sting my cheeks, feeling alive, in a way I hadn't since I was a girl. I didn't look back. The Los Angeles airport was chaos that morning. Lines curling through the terminals, families wrangling luggage, the sharp echo of rolling suitcases over tile. I held both our passports in one hand and the boarding passes in the other, keeping an eye on Grandma Helen as she shuffled beside me in her pale blue cardigan. Her hands trembled a little, not from fear, just from age. She clutched her small leather purse like it was an anchor. The overhead speakers crackled, announcing our boarding group. I looked at her and smiled. "You ready?" Her eyes widened as she looked toward the jet bridge. "You know I've never been on a plane that leaves the country. Your mother always said it was too much trouble for me to travel." "Old people shouldn't wander," she used to say. I reached for her hand. "This time you're not trouble, Grandma. You're free." Her laugh was small but bright, like the sound of a teacup against porcelain. "We found our seats in first class, and when she saw them, she froze." "Lord have mercy," she whispered, running her fingers along the armrest. "I feel like I'm trespassing." I helped her with the seatbelt, adjusting it snugly around her waist. "You're exactly where you're supposed to be." As the plane began to taxi, she leaned closer, gripping my hand tight. "Tell me when we leave the ground." When the engines roared and the plane tilted upward, she gasped softly, eyes wide as the clouds swallowed the city below. "Oh my, look at that." I smiled, watching her awe more than the view. "Beautiful, isn't it?" She nodded, still staring out the window. "Your mother never liked flying. She said the world was too big, that people should stay where they belong." I felt her hand tighten again. "But maybe she was wrong," I said quietly. The flight attendants came by with champagne and orange juice. I took a glass, but Grandma asked for tea. She sipped it slowly, then turned to me with a small smile. You know I used to dream about Paris when I was your age. I'd see pictures of the Eiffel Tower in the newspaper and think one day I'll stand under that. Then your mom was born, and that dream just stopped being mine. I squeezed her hand gently. Then maybe this is your Paris. She smiled again, eyes soft. Maybe it is. The hours passed in a blur of clouds and quiet. Somewhere over the Pacific I closed my eyes and listened to the hum of the engines, the steady rhythm of her breathing beside me. No suitcase could have carried the weight of the past we shared, but I brought it anyway, every slight, every silence, every forgotten invitation. I carried it so I could finally let it sink into the ocean and never surface again. When we landed, sunlight hit the windows with a brilliance that almost hurt. The air in the Maldives smelled like salt and orchids. At the small dock, a resort staff member greeted us with garlands of white flowers. "Welcome to paradise," he said with a smile, helping Grandma into the boat. The water shimmered turquoise under the sun as the motor started sending ripples out behind us. Grandma gripped the railing, wind lifting her gray hair. "This can't be real," she said, laughing softly. "It looks like someone painted it. It's real," I told her. "You're here." When we arrived, the staff led us along a wooden walkway over the lagoon. The ocean stretched in every direction, endless and alive. Inside our bungalow, sunlight spilled across the glass floor where fish drifted lazily beneath us. Grandma wandered the room, touching everything. The crisp white sheets, the carved wood furniture, the vase of orchids by the bed. She found the welcome drink on the table and took a cautious sip of coconut water. Her eyes widened. "Well, that's the sweetest thing I've ever tasted." I laughed, setting my bag down. "Told you they'd spoil us." Later, we sat outside on the deck, our feet bare, watching the horizon burn orange as the sun dipped. The air was warm and wet, carrying the faint scent of the sea. "Do you ever think about your mother?" Grandma asked quietly. "Every day," I said, "just not the way I used to. She and we haven't spoken much lately." Grandma admitted, "I think she resents me for loving you the way I do. But what can you do? Love doesn't divide itself neatly." I looked at her, really looked at her. The wrinkles like soft rivers around her eyes, the calm in her expression. "You don't owe her an apology for that," she smiled faintly. "I know." That night, the resort hosted an outdoor dinner by the beach. String lights hung between palm trees, flickering like stars. The sound of the waves mixed with the low hum of conversation. Plates of grilled seafood and tropical fruit arrived in waves, and for once I let myself enjoy something without guilt. Grandma dabbed her mouth with a napkin. "When I was young, I thought Paris would be the most romantic place in the world. But now I think it might be here." "Why's that?" I asked. She looked toward the water, where the moon shimmered like a coin. "Because this sunlight, this warmth, it feels like it's just for us, like the world finally made room." I felt my throat tighten, the air thick with everything unspoken. It's about time it did. My phone buzzed against the table, breaking the moment. I glanced down and saw the family group chat light up. Photo after photo. My brother Michael grinning beside the tree, Mom and Dad in matching sweaters, wine glasses raised. The caption read, "Family means everything." I scrolled once slowly. Grandma's name wasn't tagged anywhere. Neither was mine. I locked the screen, set the phone face down. "They look happy," Grandma said, noticing my expression. "They always do," I replied. We sat quietly for a moment, the sound of the surf filling the space between us. There are silences that hurt, and then there are silences that heal. I realized I'd finally crossed from one to the other. Later, back in the bungalow, I opened my laptop on the small wooden table. The screen glowed in the dim light as I typed a message into the family group chat. "Merry Christmas from the Maldives. Grandma and I have something to share tomorrow." I read it once, then hit send. The message whooshed away into the void of that familiar thread. I closed the laptop, leaned back in my chair, and exhaled. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying the scent of salt through the open doors. Grandma was already asleep, her soft snore mingling with the rhythm of the waves. I stepped out onto the deck, the ocean glimmering under the moon. The breeze tugged at my hair. I closed my eyes and let it move through me, every bit of the past dissolving into the sound of the sea. Tomorrow would come soon enough. But for now there was only this. Warm air, quiet peace, and the promise of a morning that would change everything. The night after the live stream, the resort felt too quiet, the kind of silence that follows after something irreversible. I sat on the edge of the bed, the faint sound of the tide brushing the sand outside my phone, lighting up over and over again on the nightstand. Mom, you humiliated this family. Dad, do you realize what you've done, Michael? You've lost your mind. The messages kept coming. Anger, blame, disbelief, all blending together into one long thread of noise. I didn't respond. I didn't even open most of them. The screen eventually dimmed on its own, the light fading like the echo of voices I'd stopped trying to please. Grandma Helen was already asleep in the next room, her soft breathing steady through the half-closed door. I turned off the lamp and lay back, staring at the ceiling fan turning lazily above me. The air smelled faintly of salt and sunscreen. Outside, waves rolled in and out, constant and calm, as if the ocean didn't care that my family was falling apart. I must have dozed for a while, because the next thing I remembered was the harsh buzz of my phone again. The clock on the bedside table read 6:47 a.m. When I answered, the voice on the other end was bright and intrusive. Ms. Hayes. This is Daniel Lowe from Channel 9 News. Do you have a moment to comment on the video that's circulating online? I sat up slowly. What video? The Christmas livestream, he said, almost cheerful. It's been shared thousands of times. The headline reads, Tech millionaire removes family from $100 million trust live from the Maldives. You're trending on every major platform. People are calling it one of the most dramatic family confrontations ever filmed. I closed my eyes. No comment. He started to press again, but I ended the call. For a long minute, I just sat there, the sound of the ocean pounding faintly beyond the balcony. I unlocked my phone and opened the news app. There it was. The thumbnail of me and Grandma sitting in the sunlight, the ocean glowing behind us, my hand holding the papers toward the screen. Someone had screen recorded it. The caption underneath, a daughter's revenge or justice served. It spread faster than any product launch, any press release I'd ever made. There were reaction videos, think pieces, even podcasts debating whether I was cruel or courageous. Underneath the noise, 1,000 strangers were dissecting my life like it was entertainment. A second call came through. Rachel Carter. Clara. She said without preamble. I assume you've seen the video. Yes. They're furious. Your parents have already contacted an attorney, Richard Nolan, based in Chicago. He's experienced in contesting trusts. They're claiming you manipulated your grandmother into changing the terms. I laughed softly. Manipulated. She's the only person who ever saw me clearly. Still, Rachel said they'll try to spin it. They'll say you're acting out of spite, that you're unstable. Then let them, I said. I've been called worse. There was a pause, the sound of papers shifting on her end. Just be ready. This could get ugly. It already was ugly, I said quietly. I just stopped pretending otherwise. When we hung up, I looked out toward the balcony. The sun was climbing higher, turning the water into sheets of gold. Grandma stepped outside, dressed in a pale cotton dress, her gray hair tucked neatly behind her ears. She looked rested, peaceful. Morning, sweetheart, she said, handing me a cup of coffee. Beautiful day, isn't it? Yeah, I said, forcing a smile. Beautiful. She noticed the phone in my hand, the faint glow of the notifications still piling up. They've been calling, haven't they? I nodded. All night. She sat beside me, setting her cup down on the railing. You don't have to answer. Not every storm deserves your attention. Her calmness made my throat tighten. They're angry, Grandma. They're going to make this worse. She turned to me, her eyes clear. Maybe. But remember, truth always makes people angry before it sets them free. I stared out at the ocean. They're saying I influenced you, that I made you choose. Her laugh was soft and certain. Oh, honey, I've been choosing for myself longer than they've been alive. She reached over and took my hand. Don't let their fear rewrite your story. I squeezed her hand back. I just didn't want this to turn into a circus. Then don't join the performance, she said simply. Later that morning, when I walked through the resort lobby, I noticed 2 men with cameras waiting near the entrance. Their shirts were pressed, their smiles too practiced. One stepped forward. Ms. Hayes, can we get a quick comment? The public wants to know. Did you really disinherit your family live on camera? I stopped, my suitcase handle still in my grip. No comment. He held the microphone closer. Is it true your grandmother supported the decision? Before I could answer, Grandma appeared behind me, straightening her shawl. Young man, she said firmly. I supported her before the decision, during it, and after it. You have a nice day now. The look on his face was priceless, caught between surprise and embarrassment. We walked past them together, her hand lightly on my arm. Back in the suite, I threw my phone on the bed. Messages continued flooding in, angry, shocked, curious. Some were strangers defending me, others condemning me, but one stood out among the noise, Dad. You think this is over? You'll regret what you did to this family. I stared at it for a long moment before typing a single line. No, Dad. I already regret letting it go on this long. Then I deleted it before sending. That night, the air was still and heavy. Grandma sat on the porch reading her glasses slipping down her nose. I sat beside her in silence, watching the dark outline of waves break against the horizon. After a while, she reached over, placed her hand over mine, and said softly, You're not alone, Clara. Not anymore. I looked at her, the reflection of moonlight in her eyes. Do you think I went too far? She shook her head. Truth has no distance, sweetheart. It's either spoken or it isn't. I felt something in me finally unclench something I hadn't realized I'd been holding since childhood. I used to think silence was safer, I said. So did I. She whispered, but silence only keeps you small. We sat there listening to the waves until the sky began to fade from black to gray. The world was waking again. Tomorrow would bring lawyers and headlines and more noise, but for now, there was just this. 2 women who refused to stay quiet sitting under the same stars that had watched generations before them choose comfort over truth. Not us. As the first light of dawn touched the water, Grandma smiled, her voice barely above the sound of the tide. Whatever happens next, we face it together. I nodded. Together. The waves rolled in again, soft and certain, as if to agree. The courthouse smelled faintly of polished wood and cold air. February light poured through the tall windows, sharp and colorless, turning every surface to steel. Outside, a crowd of reporters waited behind the barricades, their breath fogging in the morning chill. The headlines had already written themselves long before the hearing began. I sat at the defense table beside Rachel, who organized her notes with the same precision she used when we were drafting the trust months earlier. My palms were dry, my pulse steady. I had spent too many years shaking in front of people who didn't deserve that kind of power. Not anymore. Across the aisle sat my parents and Michael, dressed in coordinated shades of navy, like they were posing for a family portrait. Their lawyer, Richard Nolan, was everything I expected. Expensive suit, practiced frown, the kind of man who mistook arrogance for authority. When the bailiff called the court to order, his voice echoed off the marble. The judge, a woman in her 50s with clear eyes and an even clearer tone, took her seat. Nolan began immediately. Your Honor, this case is not about money. It's about influence. My clients, the Hayes family, were unjustly removed from a family trust valued at over $100 million. We believe Ms. Hayes acted impulsively under strong emotional duress and... Rachel rose calmly. Objection. Counsel is speculating. Sustained, the judge said without looking up. Stick to evidence, Mr. Nolan. He adjusted his tie regrouping. The evidence will show that Ms. Hayes was manipulated by her grandmother into an act of emotional retaliation, a public display meant to embarrass her family, not protect any legitimate interest. The word retaliation hung in the air like a challenge. I didn't look away. Rachel leaned toward me. Let him talk himself into a corner, she whispered. When it was our turn, she stood, posture confident, voice even. Your Honor, what my client did was neither impulsive nor vengeful. It was deliberate, lawful, and rooted in self-preservation. The plaintiffs claim emotional manipulation. What they neglect to mention is the decades of emotional neglect, exclusion, and exploitation Ms. Hayes endured at their hands. My father shifted in his seat, jaw tightening. My mother's lips pressed into a thin line. Michael stared straight ahead, pretending to be bored. Rachel continued. We will present testimony demonstrating that Ms. Hayes's actions were motivated not by spite, but by a fundamental truth, that family is defined by care, not bloodline. The judge nodded slightly. Proceed with your first witness. When Grandma took the stand, the room changed. She moved slowly, but with the quiet dignity of someone who had nothing left to prove. Her hands trembled slightly as she adjusted her glasses. Mrs. Whitaker. Nolan began smoothly. You're 81, correct? Yes, she said. He offered a rehearsed sign. You're aware that the changes made to the trust benefited you directly. I'm aware, she replied. And you don't find that suspicious? That your granddaughter suddenly decided to remove her parents and brother while leaving you in. Her eyes met his steady as glass. You think kindness is suspicious, Mr. Nolan? A few people in the audience laughed quietly. Even the judge's mouth twitched. Nolan recovered, trying to sound composed. I'm saying perhaps your granddaughter influenced you. Perhaps she encouraged you to. No one influences me. Grandma interrupted. I've lived long enough to know my own mind. I supported Clara because she finally did what the rest of us were too afraid to do. Tell the truth. He frowned. And what truth is that? That love without respect isn't love at all. Silence filled the room. Rachel gave me a small nod, signaling my turn. I stood smoothing the front of my blazer and walked to the stand. Nolan didn't waste time. Ms. Hayes, would you say this entire situation began because you were uninvited to Christmas? I held his gaze. That's where it started, but it's not why it ended here. He smirked. So, this was revenge? No, I said quietly. This was the moment I stopped letting people use me under the excuse of family. If that looks like revenge to you, then maybe it's time to redefine the word. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Nolan opened his mouth, but for once, no words came out. Rachel stepped forward. No further questions. The judge leaned forward slightly, hands folded. I think I've heard enough. She looked at my parents, then at me. Families often believe they can control one another indefinitely, but the law recognizes individual autonomy. The amendments to this trust were valid, witnessed, and notarized. The court finds no evidence of coercion or incapacity. Her gavel struck once, sharp and final. The motion to contest is denied. The sound echoed through me like the closing of a door I would never need to open again. Outside, the noise hit instantly. Reporters shouting questions, Shasha's flashing microphones pushed toward my face. Rachel guided me through the chaos, her hand on my shoulder. Ms. Hayes, do you consider yourself a feminist icon? Now, one shouted. Was this revenge or justice? Another yelled. I kept walking until we reached the courthouse steps. The winter sunlight hit my face warm despite the chill. Rachel turned to me, grinning slightly. How do you feel? I let out a long breath I hadn't realized I was holding. Light, I said. For the first time, really light. She smiled. You earned that. That afternoon, headlines flooded my feed again, but this time, the tone was different. From the difficult daughter to America's symbol of strength. Seattle Tech founder redefines family and power. I didn't read them all. Instead, I went home, made tea, and opened my laptop to check messages. Among the usual flood of congratulations was one name that made me pause. Ben Turner. His message was short. I watched the hearing. I always knew you were the strongest person in the room. Proud of you. I stared at the screen, smiling softly. For once, strength didn't feel like armor. It felt like air. As the city lights flickered outside my window, I closed the laptop and leaned back, listening to the quiet hum of Seattle beyond the glass. Justice doesn't always come with applause or headlines. Sometimes it's just a breath that doesn't tremble anymore. The first thing I noticed when we arrived back in the Maldives was the light. It wasn't just bright. It was alive, like the sun itself had been waiting for us. The same wooden dock stretched across the lagoon, the same scent of salt and frangipani drifted through the air. But this time, everything felt different. Maybe it was because I was different. Grandma Helen gripped my arm as we stepped off the boat. Can you believe it's been a year? She asked, her voice a mix of disbelief and joy. I smiled. Feels like yesterday, and also like a lifetime ago. The resort staff greeted us with warm smiles. A few recognized us. One young concierge even whispered, "You're the lady from the video, right?" I just smiled and nodded. For once, I didn't feel like running from that title. We were given the same bungalow overlooking the sea. The air conditioner hummed softly inside, and the sunlight painted long golden stripes across the floor. Grandma placed her hat on the table and poured tea from the small kettle by the window. "Still my favorite view," she said, handing me a cup. We sat on the balcony together, the ocean spread before us like a promise. The breeze carried the same rhythm as the year before, but I no longer heard it as an escape. It was a soundtrack to peace. "A lot can happen in a year," I said, stirring my tea. "I invested in 5 startups this year, all led by women. Olivia runs one of them now. Remember her? From Stanford." Grandma smiled, her eyes shining with quiet pride. "You're paying forward what you once had to fight for. You turned pain into purpose. That's the best kind of victory." I looked at her, the lines on her face softening under the light. You know, people kept asking me why I didn't fight my family harder, why I didn't sue them back after they lost. But the truth is, I didn't need to. They lost the moment I stopped needing their approval. She chuckled, a sound like wind through leaves. Revenge by healing. I like that. Later, we walked along the shoreline, the sand warm beneath our feet. She wore a loose linen dress, her silver hair fluttering in the breeze. I held her arm lightly as we moved, the water brushing against our ankles. "This is my favorite kind of quiet," she said. "Mine too." We stopped near a cluster of seashells washed up by the tide. Grandma picked one up, a small white conch, and held it to her ear like a child. "Still hums," she said softly. "The ocean never forgets where it's been." As the day stretched on, the sun slipped lower, melting into the horizon. The air turned golden. Grandma sat down on a weathered wooden bench near the water, humming something faint. I recognized the tune immediately. It was the song she used to teach her students decades ago. "Sing it, Grandma," I said. She laughed. "It's been years. Then make it years no more." She cleared her throat, and her voice, thin but steady, rose above the sound of the waves. It was a simple melody about hope, about finding light after darkness. Her voice wavered on some notes, but carried strength in every word. I took out my phone and started recording. The screen caught the soft light of sunset, the reflection of the sea in her eyes. When she finished, she smiled shyly. I was off key. I shook my head. It was perfect. We sat there long after the last line faded, watching the sun dissolve into the horizon, painting the ocean in molten gold. I wanted to freeze the moment, the peace, the warmth, the quiet certainty that we had survived everything that was meant to break us. Later that night, after dinner, we sat again on the balcony. The stars shimmered above the dark water. Grandma had already gone to bed, leaving her book half open on the table. I opened my laptop to check emails more out of habit than need. At the top of my inbox was a message from my parents. No subject line, no text. Just a single attachment. A photo of our old Christmas tree still standing in the same corner of the Cleveland living room. The ornaments were faded, the lights uneven, but it was unmistakable. No apology, no words, just silence. For a long time I stared at it, unsure what I felt. Sadness, maybe, but not bitterness. Maybe they were trying in their own clumsy way to reach across the distance, or maybe it was just nostalgia. Either way, it didn't matter. I clicked reply, attached the video I had just recorded, Grandma singing under the Maldives sunset, and typed one short caption, "Peace is the loudest revenge." Then I hit send. I set the laptop aside and stepped out onto the balcony. The night air was warm, the sound of the waves constant. I could see our reflections in the glass, 2 women who had chosen light over silence. They left me in the cold once. I chose the sun. And under this sky, on this sand, I wasn't the difficult daughter anymore. I was just myself. I watched the horizon shimmer under the moon and felt something shift quietly inside me. Closure, not victory. Wholeness, not defiance. The camera crew for the travel documentary we'd agreed to join next week would never capture this moment. It was too private, too sacred. Just 2 silhouettes against the sea, one older, one younger, both finally unburdened. I turned off the lights, leaving only the moon to fill the room. If you've ever been called difficult for telling the truth, remember this. Your light doesn't need anyone's permission to shine. It just needs space. So tell me, where are you finding your sunlight? Out there somewhere, the ocean carried our laughter into the dark, and I knew the world would keep turning. But for tonight, it turned exactly right.